Started with a crater the size of a city block in the middle of Shinjuku, Tokyo, not from a curse, not from a domain expansion, not from anything the Jujutsu world had ever cataloged. The crater appeared at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, and the man standing at the center of it was wearing a yellow jumpsuit and a white cape, looking mildly confused about his surroundings. There were no cursed energy readings. There were no spiritual disturbances. Every sensor Tokyo Jujutsu High had deployed across the ward registered nothing, not a flicker, not a pulse, not so much as a whisper of cursed energy from the man in the cape. The seismograph, however, registered something closer to a localized earthquake. Two special grade curses that had been nesting in the underground tunnels beneath Shinjuku for the better part of 3 years were simply gone. Not exorcised, not sealed, not driven away, but structurally erased, as if the concept of their existence had been briefly reconsidered and then quietly discarded. Satoru Gojo, the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer alive, was en route to investigate within the hour. He arrived, scanned the crater with the most refined sensory technique in the modern era, and found absolutely nothing of note. No cursed energy, no spiritual presence, no threat classification, just a bald man asking if there was a grocery store nearby. Gojo laughed. He thought it was funny. He would not think it was funny for much longer. You need to subscribe right now, because what this man is about to do to the Jujutsu world is not something you want to miss mid-story. He doesn't know he's a catastrophe yet. That's the worst part. Subscribe and stay with this until the end. Trust me, you'll want to see where this goes. The official Jujutsu High incident report filed for the Shinjuku crater event used the phrase anomalous physical displacement of unknown origin 17 times across 4 pages, which was the bureaucratic way of saying that nobody had any idea what had happened and nobody wanted to admit it. The 2 special grade curses that had been destroyed, a Category 4 spatial distortion entity that had taken up residence beneath the East Shinjuku tunnel network, and a grotesque amalgamation of human grief that had been feeding on the subway commuters for the better part of 3 years, were simply gone. Not exorcised in any documented fashion, not sealed, not driven to a lower district. The spiritual residue that should have remained after the destruction of entities that powerful was also absent, which was considered by senior sorcerers to be either impossible or a sign of something so far outside their framework that the word impossible didn't quite cover it. Ijichi had filed the paperwork with shaking hands. Yaga had read it twice and then set it down on his desk and stared at his wall for a long time. Saitama, for his part, had found the grocery store. It was 3 blocks east of the crater, a standard mid-sized supermarket, and he spent approximately 40 minutes inside comparing the price of green onions before settling on a bundle that he felt was reasonably priced. He had arrived in this world the same way he'd once punched his way through a time distortion experiment conducted by a scientist villain whose name he'd already forgotten, by accident, through a portal he hadn't asked for, into a city that looked enough like Z-City that he'd initially assumed he'd just been transported to a different ward. He had noticed the 2 large curses beneath the street because they had lunged at him when he descended into the crater, and he had dealt with them the way he dealt with everything, which was a single punch each, delivered without particular urgency. He had not considered them remarkable. He had not considered anything about the last 40 minutes remarkable. He bought his green onions, a bag of rice, and a bottle of soy sauce, and he stepped back out onto the street. That was when Yuji Itadori found him. Yuji had been deployed as part of the first response team, himself, Megumi Fushiguro, and Nobara Kujisaki, dispatched to investigate the crater site and sweep for cursed energy signatures in the surrounding blocks. Megumi had gone underground. Nobara had taken the east perimeter. Yuji had gone west, following his instincts, which were considerable given that Ryomen Sukuna occupied a portion of his body, intended to make the cursed energy environment around Yuji unusually sensitive. Yuji's instincts led him inexplicably to a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit standing outside a supermarket, holding a grocery bag and looking up at the sky with mild disappointment, apparently because it looked like rain. Yuji scanned him the way every first year learned to scan, reading the ambient cursed energy around a person, measuring their spiritual weight, categorizing them. He found nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not the nothing of a civilian, which always carried a faint biological trace of negative emotion. The genuine, total nothing of someone who simply did not interact with cursed energy as a concept. Yuji stood there for a moment, deeply uncertain, and then defaulted to the most reliable tool in his social arsenal, which was being extremely direct. He walked over and said, "Hey, sorry to bother you, but did you see anything weird around here about an hour ago? Like anything at all?" Saitama looked at him. He took in the boy's unusual physical build, clearly strong, clearly trained, the kind of physique you only got through serious work, and he felt the faint, distant twinge of something he might have called recognition if he were in a more reflective mood. Someone who trained, someone who was trying. He shrugged and said, "There were a couple of monsters under the street. I took care of them. Are you a hero? Yuji opened his mouth, then he closed it. Then he said very carefully, kind of, are you? Saitama thought about this for a moment with the same expression he used when evaluating green onion prices. Yeah, he said, I'm a hero for fun. Yuji did not know what to do with that information, so he called Megumi. Megumi Fushiguro had seen things that defied conventional explanation. He had watched Yuji Itadori survive injuries that should have been fatal, had witnessed Gojo Satoru bend space itself around his body like a second skin, had stood inside domain expansions that rewrote the rules of reality for everyone unfortunate enough to be caught inside them. He considered himself, at 17, to be someone with a reasonably calibrated sense of what was and wasn't possible. He arrived at the supermarket in 4 minutes, looked at the bald man in the yellow jumpsuit holding a grocery bag, ran his own sensory sweep, got nothing, ran it again with more focus, got nothing again, and then looked at Yuji with an expression that communicated significant internal distress without allowing any of it to reach his voice. He reads completely empty, Megumi said quietly, as if Saitama weren't standing 3 feet away. Not suppressed, not hidden, empty, like he's not there. Saitama, who had excellent hearing, looked at Megumi with mild curiosity and said, Is that bad? Megumi looked back at him and said, with complete honesty, I don't know yet. Nobara arrived 2 minutes after that, took one look at the situation, and immediately began interrogating Saitama with the focused intensity she applied to everything, asking where he came from, what he was wearing, why his cape was so clean given that he'd apparently just destroyed 2 special grade curses with his bare hands, and whether he was affiliated with any known organization. Saitama answered all of these questions in the order they were asked. A different world, it was his hero costume. He didn't know why it stayed clean either, and no. Nobara processed this and turned to Megumi and said, He's either the most dangerous thing we've ever encountered or he's completely harmless, and Megumi said, Those are not mutually exclusive, which was the most precise thing anyone said for the rest of the afternoon. The call went up the chain within the hour. Ijichi relayed it to Yaga, Yaga relayed it to the higher-ups, and somewhere in that chain of communication the phrase "zero cursed energy signature," confirmed destruction of 2 special grade entities, landed on a desk that belonged to someone with enough authority to make a single phone call. That phone call went to Satoru Gojo, who was in the middle of a lesson he was not particularly invested in, and who listened to the summary with the phone held loosely in one hand and a bored expression that sharpened almost imperceptibly somewhere around the phrase "no spiritual residue remaining." He told his students class was cancelled, said it with the same tone he used for everything, and was in Shinjuku in less than 15 minutes. Gojo arrived with the energy of someone who had decided in advance that this was going to be interesting. He dropped out of the sky, not literally, but he moved with enough casual velocity that the distinction barely mattered, landed near the group, pushed his blindfold up slightly so the edges of his 6 eyes were active and scanning, and looked at Saitama. 6 eyes were the most sophisticated sensory apparatus in the Jujutsu world, capable of reading the cursed energy output of any entity down to the molecular level, capable of tracking the spiritual residue of techniques used hours ago, capable of perceiving things that no other sorcerer could perceive. Gojo stood there for 4 full seconds, which was for him an extremely long time to spend on an initial assessment, and then lowered his blindfold completely and said, Huh, just that. 1 syllable. Yuji had never heard Gojo say huh before in a tone that carried genuine uncertainty, and it was, frankly, unsettling. You can't see him either, Megumi said. It was not a question. Gojo smiled, but it was the smile he used when something had surprised him and he hadn't decided how to feel about it yet. I can see him fine, Gojo said, with my regular eyes. With my actual eyes, he's a perfectly normal-looking bald man. With my 6 eyes, he paused, and the pause was significant. He doesn't exist. Saitama, who had been following this conversation with the patience of someone waiting for a bus, said, So is someone going to explain what's going on, or, and Gojo said very brightly, Do you want to fight? The 3 first-years made various sounds of alarm. Saitama looked at Gojo with the particular expression he reserved for people who seemed like they might actually be worth the effort, a faint, cautious interest buried under layers of anticipatory disappointment, and said, Sure. Gojo grinned like someone who had just been handed the most interesting problem of his career. He had no idea in that moment how completely and permanently that assessment was about to be revised. He threw the first strike with enough force to level a building, and Saitama caught it with an open palm, and the shockwave flattened every parked car on the block in a perfect circle around them, and Gojo's smile went very still. The 6 eyes were still reading nothing. The hand holding his fist was not cursed energy. It was not a technique. It was not anything the Jujutsu system had a category for. It was just a hand, and it had stopped him completely, and somewhere in Gojo Satoru's extraordinary mind, the first cold edge of something he hadn't felt in a very long time began to make itself known. The official meeting was called for 6 o'clock the following morning, which in Jujutsu high terms meant that whatever had happened was serious enough to pull the higher-ups out of their carefully maintained routines and into the same room before they'd had time to construct their usual political defenses. Yaga sat at the head of the table with the incident report in front of him and the expression of a man who had read the same document 8 times and found it no more comprehensible on the 8th reading than on the first. The higher-ups, 3 of them present in person, 2 attending through intermediaries who would relay their responses with appropriate delays to maintain the illusion of deliberation, had received the same document and had spent the intervening hours doing what institutional power always does when confronted with something it cannot process, which was attempting to force the new information into an existing category regardless of whether it fit. The category they kept returning to was special grade. They kept returning to it because it was the highest classification they had, and because using it gave them the psychological comfort of believing the situation was contained within their existing framework. It was not contained within their existing framework. It was not contained at all. The core problem, as Yaga laid it out with the patience of someone who had already accepted that this conversation was going to be painful, was threefold. First, the individual in question registered 0 cursed energy by every measurement technique available to the Jujutsu world, which meant that every threat assessment protocol they possessed was functionally useless. Special grade classification was based on cursed energy output. You could not assign a cursed energy output to something that had no cursed energy. Second, the individual had destroyed 2 special grade curses with physical strikes that left no spiritual residue, no technique signature, and no evidence of any cursed tool or binding vow, which meant the destruction mechanism was entirely outside their documented reality. Third, and this was the part that Yaga delivered with particular care, watching the faces around the table as he said it, Gojo Satoru had attempted a direct physical engagement and had been stopped. Not countered with a technique, not deflected through a binding vow, stopped with a hand, while Gojo was using infinity. The room was quiet for a moment after that. One of the higher-up intermediaries leaned over and whispered something to his principal through a communication device. The principal's response took 40 seconds to come back, which suggested that the principal had needed 40 seconds to decide whether to pretend they'd heard incorrectly or to simply accept the statement and move forward. They moved forward. Gojo Satoru was stopped, one of the higher-ups said, and his voice had the careful flatness of someone reading from a document they didn't write. Physically stopped while infinity was active. Yaga said yes. The higher-up said, and the individual's cursed energy reading at the moment of contact. Yaga said 0, unchanged, constant 0. Another silence. Then, from the far end of the table, the oldest of the 3 present higher-ups said, in a voice that carried the weight of someone who had spent decades at the top of a system he believed was comprehensive, then we need a new category. That sentence, 4 words, entirely reasonable given the circumstances, was the first institutional acknowledgement that the Jujutsu world's framework for understanding power had a ceiling, and that something had just walked through it carrying a grocery bag. The new category did not have a name yet. The paperwork that would eventually name it would go through 11 drafts over the following week, each one trying to capture in bureaucratic language the nature of something that actively resisted bureaucratic language. The final version settled on the phrase non-cursed existential anomaly, which was accurate in the way that calling a hurricane a weather event is accurate, technically defensible, and completely inadequate. Gojo himself was not present at the meeting. He had been asked to attend and had declined in the way he always declined things he found beneath his current interest level, which was to simply not show up and then act mildly surprised when anyone mentioned it. He was, instead, back in Shinjuku, sitting on the roof of a building 2 blocks from the crater, thinking. This was unusual enough behavior for Gojo that Nanami Kento, who happened to be passing through the ward on a separate assignment and spotted him from the street, stopped and looked up for a long moment before deciding that whatever was occupying Gojo's attention was probably something he should know about and climbing the building to find out. He found Gojo sitting cross-legged on the roof edge with his blindfold pushed up onto his forehead, fully active 6 eyes, scanning, continuously scanning, aimed at a spot 3 streets over where Saitama was apparently eating a convenience store lunch on a park bench. You've been watching him, Nanami said. Gojo said, I've been trying to watch him. My 6 eyes keep trying to tell me he's not there. Nanami looked in the direction Gojo was looking, saw a bald man eating onigiri on a bench and said, he looks like he's there. Gojo said, that's exactly the problem. What neither of them said, but both of them understood, was that the Jujutsu world had been built on the assumption that everything with power could be read, classified, and eventually countered. The binding vow system, the domain expansion framework, the cursed technique hierarchy, all of it rested on the foundational premise that power had a shape, and that if you could perceive the shape you could find its edge. Saitama had no shape, he had no edge. He was sitting on a park bench eating rice and looking at pigeons, and he was, by every measure, the strongest system in the world possessed, completely invisible, and the implications of that invisibility were only beginning to unfold. The curse appeared at 11:14 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 days after Saitama's arrival, and it was unlike anything Tokyo's Jujutsu response teams had documented in the modern era. It emerged from the Shibuya underground, not from the station itself, which carried its own traumatic spiritual weight from events that the Jujutsu world still hadn't fully processed, but from the network of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the commercial district, where human grief and commercial anxiety and the particular concentrated misery of 10 million people living in close proximity had been quietly fermenting for decades. The curse was enormous, a special grade entity by any reasonable measure, and it moved through the underground infrastructure with a kind of purposeful intelligence that the response team's advanced scout described in his radio transmission back to base as like it knows where it's going. It surfaced through the floor of a department store at 11:22 p.m., which was late enough that the civilian casualty potential was reduced but not eliminated, and it began moving northeast through the Shibuya Scramble crossing with a trajectory that the tactical analysts, reviewing the footage afterward, would identify as a direct line toward the Shinjuku crater site, toward Saitama. The response team deployed in under 8 minutes, which was excellent by any standard. Nanami led the ground unit. Yuji and Nobara came in from the east. 2 senior sorcerers from a regional branch held the perimeter. The evacuation of the surrounding blocks went as well as these things ever went, which meant chaotically and incompletely, with civilians who refused to move and others who moved in the wrong direction, and a general atmosphere of controlled panic that the sorcerers worked through with the professional efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Nanami engaged the curse first, reading its structure with the analytical precision that made him one of the most reliable combat sorcerers in the current generation, identifying its ratio point, calculating the approach. He hit it twice with ratio technique, clean strikes that should have destabilized a curse of this class significantly. The curse absorbed both hits and kept moving. Not regenerated, absorbed, as if the conceptual damage of the technique had been processed and integrated rather than endured. Nanami had never seen a curse do that before, and he filed the observation in the part of his mind he reserved for things that required immediate reassessment. Yuji hit it from the left flank with a black flash, the precise convergence of physical and cursed energy that represented the highest expression of close-range combat available to a sorcerer of his level. The black flash landed clean. Nanami saw the flash, saw the curse stagger, and then watched it straighten and turn toward Yuji with what he could only describe as focused attention, as if the black flash had not damaged it so much as introduced it to Yuji as something worth considering. Nobara came in overhead with resonance, driving nails into the curse's extended tissue and detonating the connection, and that worked better. The curse lost a significant portion of its upper structure and made a sound that the civilians still on the street would describe to reporters the following morning as like a building deciding to cry. But it kept moving. It kept moving northeast, absorbing damage, processing it, integrating it, and the tactical picture that was assembling itself in Nanami's mind as he tracked its heading was one he found deeply uncomfortable. It was not attacking them, it was using them. Every technique that landed, every cursed energy impact, every binding vow interaction was being processed by this curse in real time, and the direction it was moving never changed. It was heading for the anomaly. It was heading for Saitama the way a compass needle heads for magnetic north, not with aggression, but with orientation, as if his presence in this world was generating a pull that the curse ecology was responding to without fully understanding why. Saitama was asleep when it arrived. He had found a vacant apartment in a building near the Shinjuku crater. The building's other residents had evacuated after the initial incident, and the landlord had not yet figured out what to do about the situation, so Saitama had let himself in through an unlocked unit on the 4th floor, determined it was unoccupied, and gone to sleep on the floor because there was no futon and he hadn't yet figured out the local currency situation well enough to buy one. He woke up because something very large hit the exterior wall of the building with enough force to crack the concrete, and he sat up, looked at the crack spreading across the wall with mild irritation, and stood up. By the time he reached the window, the curse had torn through the north face of the building entirely, exposing 3 floors to the open air and filling the resulting gap with its own body mass, and it was oriented directly toward him with every sensory apparatus it possessed. Saitama looked at it. It was enormous, and it was clearly operating on a level of intelligence that curses didn't usually demonstrate. and it was by any objective measure the most dangerous thing the Shibuya ward had produced in years. He punched it once lightly with the casual economy of someone swatting a fly, and it came apart so completely that Nanami, arriving on scene 30 seconds later, found nothing but structural damage and the faint smell of something that had recently ceased to exist. The building's north face was gone, the curse was gone. Saitama was standing in the open air on what had been his apartment floor, 4 stories up, looking down at the street with his hands in his pockets. He looked at Nanami. He said, "Do you know how I can get a futon around here? I haven't figured out the money yet." Nanami stood at the base of the destroyed building, in the wreckage of what had been a Shibuya response operation, listening to the sirens from the evacuation still sounding in the distance, and took a very long breath before answering. What nobody said in the debrief that followed, but everyone understood, was that the curse had not appeared randomly. It had appeared in response to Saitama's presence. It had moved toward him with purpose. The cursed ecosystem of Tokyo, the vast invisible spiritual architecture of accumulated human suffering and negative emotion that underpinned everything the Jujutsu world existed to manage, had noticed the anomaly, and it had sent something to investigate. The investigation had lasted approximately 4 seconds. The ecosystem would need to try harder, and the ecosystem, as it turned out, was already working on it. The Cabinet Intelligence and Research Office had been monitoring the Shinjuku and Shibuya incidents through its Cursed Event Liaison Division for 72 hours before the Deputy Chief of Cabinet made the decision to escalate beyond passive observation. The Liaison Division existed in one of those carefully maintained bureaucratic spaces where the government's official position, that curses were a matter for Jujutsu High and its affiliated institutions, coexisted with the practical reality that the government had been quietly tracking cursed incidents for decades, and had developed its own analytical framework for assessing when a situation crossed from a Jujutsu problem into a national security problem. The threshold for that crossing was, internally, defined as an event that Jujutsu infrastructure cannot contain or resolve within its existing operational capacity. The Shibuya building destruction had been the 3rd incident in 4 days. The cursed energy response teams had been on continuous deployment. The infrastructure was not containing it. The threshold had been crossed, and the Deputy Chief of Cabinet, a precise and humorless woman named Inao Sachiko who had spent 20 years in intelligence and had never once been surprised by anything, was surprised. The file on her desk described an individual of unknown origin, 0 cursed energy signature, confirmed physical destruction of 4 special grade curses across 3 incidents, confirmed physical contact with Gojo Satoru resulting in Gojo's offensive technique being neutralized, and no classification within any existing threat framework the Jujutsu institutions had provided. The non-cursed existential anomaly designation that Jujutsu High had filed was noted in the file, with the particular bureaucratic contempt that intelligence professionals reserve for euphemisms that tell them nothing. He now read the file 3 times, looked at the structural damage assessments for the Shinjuku crater and the Shibuya apartment building, looked at the confirmed kill count for special grade entities, 4 in 4 days by one individual without apparent effort, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces Special Operations Command. The second was to an office whose existence was not publicly acknowledged, and whose mandate covered events that fell outside normal Jujutsu jurisdiction, which was a polite way of saying it covered the gap between what Jujutsu High reported and what the government actually needed to know. The JGSDF response was measured and professional, which in this context meant that it was deeply inadequate to the situation, but was deployed with considerable competence regardless. A surveillance unit was established within 48 hours, operating from 3 positions in the Shinjuku ward, using equipment designed for monitoring cursed energy events with non-cursed instrumentation, seismic sensors, thermal imaging, acoustic monitoring, the kind of hardware that had been developed precisely because the government had always understood that relying entirely on sorcerers for situational awareness was a strategic vulnerability. The surveillance unit found Saitama without difficulty because Saitama was not hiding. He was, on the morning of the surveillance unit's first operational day, attempting to navigate the Tokyo subway system, which he found confusing in a way that the cursed ecosystem of an entire major city had apparently failed to be. He had a paper map. He was holding it upside down. 3 different commuters had tried to help him, and he had thanked all of them with the same mild, distracted politeness he applied to everything that wasn't a monster. The surveillance footage went back to Inao within 6 hours. She watched it for a long time. Then she requested a direct briefing from Jujutsu High, which was an unusual enough step that Yaga came personally rather than sending a representative, and the meeting that followed was the first formal conversation between the government's shadow infrastructure and the Jujutsu institutional hierarchy about the specific nature of the threat. Conducted with the particular diplomatic tension of two organizations that had maintained a careful distance from each other for years and were now being forced into the same room by circumstances neither had planned for. Yaga laid out what they knew, which was less than Inao wanted and more than she'd expected. 0 cursed energy, physical capability beyond any documented scale, curses actively orienting toward him as a target. Domain expansions non-functional in his presence. This last point had been established when a mid-grade curse had activated a partial domain in the Shinjuku underground 2 days earlier, and the domain had destabilized immediately upon Saitama walking through it, the internal environment collapsing like a tent in a high wind, the curse itself destroyed before it could process what had happened. Inao listened to all of this and then said very carefully, "What is Jujutsu High's containment strategy?" Yaga said equally carefully, "We don't have one." Inao looked at him for a moment. "Is he hostile?" Yaga considered the question with genuine seriousness and said, "No, he's told our sorcerers he's a hero. He appears to mean it." Inao said, "And yet every major cursed entity in the Tokyo region is moving toward him." Yaga said, "Yes." Another silence. Then Inao said, "So his presence here is generating the threat even as he eliminates it." And Yaga said, "That is our current assessment." What neither of them addressed directly, because addressing it directly would have required both of them to say something that their respective institutions were not yet prepared to formally acknowledge, was the second half of the implication. If Saitama's presence was generating new and escalating cursed responses, then removing him from Tokyo was the logical solution. And if removing him from Tokyo was not possible, if a man who had stopped Gojo Satoru's infinity with an open hand could not be made to go somewhere he didn't want to go, then the situation was not a containment problem. It was something else entirely, and neither the Jujutsu hierarchy nor the government's intelligence apparatus had a word for it, yet that they were comfortable using in an official document. The JGSDF surveillance unit filed its second report at midnight. The seismic sensors had registered 17 low-level impacts in the Shinjuku ward over the preceding 12 hours, curses drawn to the anomaly being destroyed on contact. 17 in 12 hours. The rate was accelerating, the ecosystem was not backing down. It was escalating, and the escalation curve on the surveillance unit's graph was pointing in a direction that made the analyst who drew it request, for the first time in his career, a direct line to the deputy chief of cabinet outside of normal reporting channels. The cursed ecology of Japan had not operated on a conscious level in any meaningful sense for most of its history. It was not a mind. It was not an organization. It was the accumulated spiritual byproduct of human suffering across centuries, a vast and formless reservoir of negative emotion that generated cursed spirits the way a wound generates infection, not through intention, but through the simple biological logic of an environment responding to damage. It had no strategy. It had no memory. It had thresholds and feedback mechanisms and a kind of distributed pressure system that produced stronger curses when the existing ones were destroyed faster than new ones could form, the same way a forest fire produces more intense heat at its center when the fuel density is highest. Saitama had been in Tokyo for 6 days. In those 6 days he had destroyed, by the JGSDF surveillance unit's seismic count, 43 cursed entities, ranging from low-grade street-level spirits to the 4 special-grade encounters already documented. The feedback mechanism had noticed. The pressure system had responded. And on the morning of the 7th day, something emerged from the accumulated weight of that response that was not, strictly speaking, a curse in any category that Jujutsu High's taxonomy had previously needed to accommodate. Gojo felt it first. He was in the middle of a conversation with Yaga about the latest surveillance report when his 6 eyes, which operated continuously whether he was consciously directing them or not, registered a cursed energy signature of a scale he had not encountered since the Shibuya incident, since the king of curses himself. He stopped mid-sentence. Yaga, who had known Gojo long enough to recognize the specific quality of silence that meant something had genuinely caught his attention, stopped talking and waited. Gojo stood very still for approximately 4 seconds, which was the longest Yaga had ever seen him stand still outside of combat, and then said, "Something is forming, something big, not a curse, not exactly." Yaga said, "Where?" Gojo said, "Everywhere. It's not in a location, it's in the pressure." It's like he paused, searching for language that fit, and Gojo not having immediate language for something was itself alarming. It's like the whole system is trying to build something it doesn't have a blueprint for. What the system was building, as the senior research division at Jujutsu High, would reconstruct over the following 48 hours from spiritual residue analysis and Gojo's real-time 6 eyes observations, was an adaptive response entity. The cursed ecology had been generating standard curses in response to Saitama, and the standard curses had been destroyed. It had generated special grade entities, and those had been destroyed. The feedback loop had run through its normal escalation sequence and found every tier of the sequence insufficient, and the accumulated pressure of that insufficiency had begun to do something that cursed energy was not, under normal circumstances, capable of doing. It had begun to problem solve. Not with intelligence, not with the cold, deliberate reasoning of a human mind, but with the blind, relentless adaptive logic of a system under extreme stress, trying every configuration it hadn't tried yet, discarding failures, retaining anything that registered as even marginally different from what had already been destroyed. It was evolution compressed into days instead of millennia, driven by the specific pressure of an anomaly that the system could not process through any of its existing responses. The entity that began to coalesce in the spiritual infrastructure beneath the Kanto region over the following 18 hours was not visible to conventional sensing. It had no physical form yet. It was a pattern, a vast, distributed pattern of cursed energy that was simultaneously present in 17 locations across Tokyo and Kanagawa, drawing from the grief and fear and accumulated suffering of the entire regional population, organizing itself around a single purpose that was not quite intention and not quite instinct but something in between. Every sorcerer in the Tokyo region with significant sensory capability felt it as a kind of pressure change, the spiritual equivalent of a barometric drop before a storm. Nanami described it in his field report as the sensation of the air before something very large decides to fall. The first years felt it as a persistent unease that none of them could localize. Gojo tracked it continuously with his 6 eyes and watched it grow with the focused attention of someone who had spent his entire career as the ceiling of his world's power, and was now watching something being assembled that might, for the first time, require him to take seriously. Saitama felt none of this. He had spent the day attempting to locate a hero registration office, operating on the reasonable assumption that if this world had heroes it probably had some organizational structure for them, and had instead found a city ward office where a very patient clerk had spent 40 minutes trying to explain to him why his request didn't match any existing registration category, before giving him a form to fill out that was clearly designed for a different purpose. He filled it out anyway. He wrote hero in the occupation field. He wrote Saitama in the name field. He left the cursed energy output field blank because it did not apply. He submitted the form. The clerk filed it in a folder that would eventually find its way to Inao's desk via 3 intermediary offices, each of which had added a sticky note expressing increasing levels of institutional confusion. He was walking back through Shinjuku when the first physical manifestation of the adaptive entity appeared. It came up through the street, not through a specific point, not from a tunnel or a drain or a structural gap, but through the asphalt itself, which simply ceased to be solid and became permeable to something that had decided the boundary between underground and surface was a suggestion rather than a rule. What emerged was not shaped like any curse Yuji or Megumi or Nobara had encountered before. It had mass, considerable mass, and it had the dense, pressurized quality of something that had been compressed beyond its natural state before being released, like a spring held down for too long finally letting go. It oriented towards Saitama immediately. Everything did now, and then something happened that nobody on the response team that arrived 4 minutes later had anticipated, because nobody had thought to anticipate it. The entity didn't attack. It expanded, spread itself across the full block in a thin, distributed layer, making itself simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, as if it had learned from the 43 failures before it that presenting a single concentrated point of mass to this particular target was a strategy with a perfect failure rate. Saitama looked at it. He looked at the way it had spread itself across the block, covering the street and the building facades and the overhead wiring in a layer of pressurized cursed mass. He scratched the back of his head. Then he punched the ground, not the entity. The ground once directly beneath his feet, with approximately the force he used when he was moderately interested in ending something quickly. The shockwave traveled outward through the street in a perfect radial pattern, and everything the entity had distributed itself across was caught in that wave simultaneously. And the entity came apart not piece by piece but all at once, every distributed fragment disrupted at the same moment, the adaptive strategy it had developed undone in the same instant it was first deployed. The street was destroyed for half a block in every direction. 3 storefronts lost their facades. The response team, arriving to find Saitama standing in a debris field the size of a city intersection, looking at his hand with mild curiosity, filed a report that the senior analysts would spend 3 days trying to categorize before simply writing anomalous ground strike, full entity dissolution, mechanism unknown, and moving on. But Gojo, tracking the spiritual aftermath with his 6 eyes from 3 kilometers away, saw something in the dissolution that nobody else had the sensory resolution to perceive. The entity had not simply been destroyed. Its pattern had scattered, distributed itself into the spiritual environment in fragments too small to coalesce immediately, seeding the cursed ecology of the entire Kanto region with the adaptive logic it had developed in its brief existence. The ecosystem had not failed. It had learned, and it had distributed that learning as widely as possible before being erased, which meant that the next thing the system built would start from a more advanced position than the last. Gojo stood on his rooftop, 6 eyes running at full capacity, watching the dispersal pattern spread across the spiritual map of the region, and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling. Not fear exactly, something more precise than fear. The recognition that the situation had just changed in a way that would not change back. The meeting happened on neutral ground, which in practical terms meant the roof of a parking structure in East Shinjuku that Gojo had used before for conversations he didn't want overheard by either Jujutsu Kaisen's administrative layer or the government's surveillance apparatus, both of which he was aware of and both of which he considered in their different ways insufficiently equipped to handle what he needed to discuss. He had asked Nanami to come. He had asked Yaga. He had, after some internal deliberation, asked Yuji, not because Yuji's tactical input was what the conversation required, but because Yuji had spent more time in direct proximity to Saitama than anyone else at Jujutsu High and had developed, in that time, something that Gojo recognized as genuinely useful and that he would not have called trust exactly, but that functioned similarly. He had also, through Yuji, extended an invitation to Saitama himself, framed as casually as possible, which meant Yuji had walked up to Saitama on a street corner and said, "Hey, some people want to talk to you. It's important," and Saitama had said, "Is it going to take long? I was going to make dinner," and Yuji had said, "Maybe bring something to eat." Saitama arrived with a convenience store bag containing 2 rice balls and a canned coffee, and sat on a concrete barrier at the edge of the roof with the relaxed posture of someone attending a neighborhood meeting about parking regulations. Gojo stood across from him with his blindfold pushed up, 6 eyes active, and for the first time since Saitama's arrival he looked at him not as a phenomenon to be analyzed but as a person to be spoken to directly, which required a small but significant adjustment in how Gojo organized his own thinking. The 6 eyes kept returning their null reading. He had learned over the past 6 days to look past the null reading at the physical reality underneath it, the man who was actually there, eating a rice ball, waiting patiently. "The ecosystem is adapting," Gojo said without preamble, because he had decided that the conversation would go better without one. "You've been here 7 days. In 7 days you've destroyed enough cursed entities to account for roughly 3 months of normal jujutsu operational output. The system has noticed, and it's not backing down, it's learning." Saitama finished his rice ball, folded the wrapper neatly, and said, "Okay." Gojo waited. Saitama said, "Is that it?" Gojo said, "No. The next thing it builds will be more sophisticated than the last one. The one this morning was already more sophisticated than anything I've seen the ecosystem generate unprompted. It distributed itself. It tried to solve the problem of you." Saitama said, "It didn't, though." Gojo said, "Not this time." Nanami spoke then, which he had been waiting to do until the framing was established, because Nanami preferred to place his words precisely rather than early. He said, "The concern isn't your capability. The concern is the response curve. Every entity you destroy accelerates the ecosystem's adaptation cycle. The stronger the entities become, the more cursed energy they require the ecosystem to generate, and the more cursed energy in the environment, the higher the concentration of human suffering required to sustain it. We're not talking about a military escalation where both sides get stronger and the conflict stays contained. We're talking about a feedback loop that draws on civilian suffering as its fuel source. Every fight you win makes the next fight more expensive for the people who live here." Saitama was quiet for a moment after that, not the quiet of someone who hadn't understood, the quiet of someone who had understood and was sitting with the specific weight of it. He looked out across the Shinjuku skyline, which was lit up in the way that major cities are always lit up at night, bright and dense and full of the evidence of human activity, of people doing ordinary things in ordinary buildings, completely unaware of the spiritual infrastructure that ran beneath and through all of it. He said, "So my being here makes things worse for them even when I'm winning." Nanami said, "Yes." Saitama said, "That's a familiar problem." Yaga had been standing back, listening, assessing not Saitama specifically, but the dynamic of the conversation, the way Saitama processed information, the quality of his attention. He had spent his career evaluating young sorcerers, reading the difference between those who heard difficult truths and deflected them and those who heard them and absorbed them, and what he saw in Saitama's response was something he hadn't expected and found unexpectedly reassuring. Not naivety. Not the reflexive optimism of someone who hadn't been damaged by the world, something older than that. The particular steadiness of someone who had already been through the version of this where they thought winning was enough and had come out the other side of it with a more complicated understanding. He stepped forward and said, "We're not asking you to stop, we're asking you to work with us. If you engage on our terms, coordinated response, controlled environments where possible, targeting that minimizes the ecosystem's feedback exposure, we can reduce the adaptation acceleration. We can't eliminate it, but we can slow it." Saitama looked at him. You want me to fight on a schedule? Yaga said, more or less. Saitama said, I can do that, I don't have anything else going on. Gojo, who had been watching this exchange with his full attention, said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, there's one more thing. Everyone on the roof waited. Gojo had the quality, when he chose to deploy it, of making a room feel like the air had been slightly pressurized, a sense that what came next was going to reframe everything that had come before. He said, the entity this morning didn't just adapt. When I tracked the dissolution, the adaptive pattern distributed into the ecosystem before it was destroyed. It seeded the system with what it had learned, which means the next generation of response entities starts from a more sophisticated baseline. He paused. I've been running models with my 6 eyes since this morning. Based on the adaptation rate and the seed distribution pattern, I think we have somewhere between 10 and 14 days before the ecosystem produces something that can't be solved with a coordinated response. Something that won't be a single entity. Something that will be a simultaneous, distributed event across the entire Kanto region. Yuji said, what does that mean? Gojo looked at him, and for once the easy brightness that lived in Gojo's expression as a permanent default was entirely absent, replaced by something flatter and more serious than Yuji had ever seen there. It means 10 million people generating fear and grief and negative emotion simultaneously, in a coordinated spiritual event, with no single point of intervention. It means the ecosystem stops sending things at Saitama and starts consuming the city from the inside. He looked back at Saitama, and I don't know if you can punch that. Saitama ate his second rice ball. He looked at the city. He said, I've never not been able to punch something. Gojo said, I know. He said it without his usual edge, without the performance of confidence that was his standard register. He said it like a statement of fact that he was holding carefully, because the thing he was afraid of was not that Saitama couldn't punch it. The thing he was afraid of was what happened to the city while he was figuring out how. The operational plan took 3 days to assemble, which was faster than any comparable strategic deployment Jujutsu High had ever produced, and still felt, given Gojo's 10 to 14 day window, uncomfortably close to the margin. Yaga ran the planning sessions personally, pulling in Nanami for tactical architecture, the senior research division for spiritual ecology analysis, and 2 regional branch chiefs whose operational territories covered the areas of the Kanto region showing the highest adaptation seed concentrations from the morning entity's dissolution. The government liaison attended as an observer and relayed summaries to Inao every 6 hours, and Inao relayed condensed versions to the deputy chief of cabinet. And somewhere in that chain of communication, the phrase, coordinated preemptive spiritual ecology intervention, was coined by someone who needed language that could appear in an official document without causing a parliamentary crisis, and it stuck. The JGSDF Special Operations Command was formally read into the operation on day 2, contributing logistical infrastructure, civilian evacuation planning, and the kind of large-scale coordination capacity that Jujutsu institutions, which had always operated in deliberate secrecy, had never needed to develop on their own. It was the first time in the modern era that sorcerers and the military had shared an operational command structure, and the friction it generated was considerable and largely irrelevant, because both sides understood that the alternative was worse. Saitama attended 2 of the planning sessions. He sat in the back, listened carefully, asked questions that were consistently more tactically precise than his general demeanor suggested he was capable of, and agreed to everything requested of him with a cooperative straightforwardness that the branch chiefs found either deeply reassuring or faintly unsettling, depending on their individual dispositions. The core of the plan was built around Gojo's spiritual ecology models, identifying the 17 highest concentration seed sites across the Kanto region, deploying coordinated exorcism teams to each site simultaneously to disrupt the adaptation network before it could achieve the distributed coherence Gojo had projected, and positioning Saitama at the convergence point. Single location where the seed network structural logic suggested the primary entity would attempt to coalesce if the distributed approach was interrupted. The theory was sound. The execution would depend on 17 simultaneous successful exorcisms, which required every capable sorcerer in the Tokyo region to be deployed at once, which meant there would be no reserve, no second wave, no fallback capacity if any of the 17 sites produced something the assigned team couldn't handle. Nanami had noted this in the planning document with the precise, unadorned language he used for things he considered significant risks. Yaga had noted it also. Both of them had signed the plan anyway, because the alternative, waiting for the distributed event Gojo had projected, was not an option that either of them was willing to accept. The operation launched at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, coordinated to the minute across all 17 sites. The civilian evacuation of the highest risk zones had been completed over the preceding 48 hours under cover of a gas leak notification that the ward offices had issued with the professional efficiency of organizations that had been providing cover stories for cursed events for decades. The streets in the target zones were empty or close to it. The sorcerer teams were in position. Gojo was at the convergence point, a specific intersection in central Shinjuku that his 6 eyes had identified as the structural center of the seed network. Standing in the empty street with his hands in his pockets and his blindfold up, watching the spiritual architecture of the city with the full resolution of the most sophisticated sensory system the Jujutsu world had ever produced. Saitama stood next to him, hands also in his pockets, watching the same empty street with his regular eyes and seeing nothing in particular. "You can feel it?" Saitama asked. Gojo said, "Like standing inside an engine that's about to turn over." Saitama nodded as if this made complete sense to him, which perhaps, given his experience with large-scale threats, it did. The 17 exorcisms began on schedule. 14 of them went cleanly, the assigned teams hitting their sites with the coordinated precision of people who had trained for this specific deployment and found the targets exactly where the models had placed them. The 15th site produced a response entity that had already advanced beyond the seed stage into early coherence, and the assigned team, 2 senior sorcerers from the Kyoto branch, engaged it with everything they had and held it for 11 minutes before it was contained, at significant personal cost to both of them. The 16th site was empty when the team arrived. The seed energy dispersed in a pattern that the team's analyst described in real-time radio transmission as deliberate, as if the site had been vacated in advance of their arrival, and the team spent 4 minutes confirming the dispersal before reporting back, 4 minutes during which Gojo, monitoring the overall pattern with his 6 eyes, felt the spiritual architecture of the network shift in a way that suggested the missing seed energy had not dispersed at all but had relocated. The 17th site never engaged. The team arrived, found the site structurally intact, and then found that the cursed energy concentration was not dispersing or advancing but maintaining a stable, pressurized state that didn't match any of the behavioral models, as if it was waiting. Gojo understood what was happening approximately 40 seconds before it became physically visible, which was enough time to say it changed the plan to Saitama in a tone that conveyed the full weight of what that meant, but not enough time to do anything structural about it. The seed network had not been functioning as 17 independent sites building toward a single convergence. It had been functioning as a single distributed organism, and the 17 sites had been its sensory array, and the operation had not disrupted the network. It had taught it the operational parameters of the response, the timing, the deployment pattern, the location of every sorcerer in the Kanto region at 3 a.m. on a Thursday. The entity that coalesced at the convergence point did not come from underground. It came from the air, from the spiritual pressure that had been building across the entire region simultaneously, condensing into a single point above the Shinjuku intersection with the focused intentionality of something that had processed the Jujutsu world's best coordinated response and used it as a blueprint for its own assembly. It was not enormous in the way the earlier entities had been enormous. It was dense, compressed to a fraction of the size its energy mass would have suggested, the way a star is dense, the way pressure becomes its own kind of structural integrity. It had no recognizable form. It had the quality of a decision made by something that didn't have a mind but had arrived, through the relentless logic of adaptation and failure and adaptation again, at a functional equivalent. It looked at Saitama, not oriented toward him, not drawn by pressure differential, but looked, with the specific directed attention of something that had spent 10 days processing 47 failed attempts and had finally organized all of that processing into a single coherent act. And then it opened what served as its domain, not with the formal invocation structure of a sorcerer's domain expansion, but with the raw distributed pressure of an ecosystem-level event, and the domain it opened was not a bounded space. It was the city, all of it. Every cursed seed site simultaneously activated, every fragment of distributed adaptive energy engaged at once, and the domain's guaranteed hit was not a technique. It was despair, the concentrated ecosystem-generated despair of 10 million people's accumulated suffering, focused and directed and delivered as a spiritual pressure that should have been, by every parameter the Jujutsu world had for measuring such things, unsurvivable. Gojo activated Unlimited Void immediately, his own domain expanding to counter, and the collision between the two domains produced a pressure event that shattered every window in a 6-block radius and sent a shockwave through the spiritual environment that every sorcerer in the Kanto region felt simultaneously as a physical impact. His domain held, barely, the boundaries straining against something that wasn't trying to overpower it so much as dissolve it, to unmake the conceptual structure that made domain expansion possible, and in the space his domain bought, Saitama walked forward through the concentrated despair of an ecosystem-level spiritual event as if it were weather. Not unaffected, there was something in his expression as he moved through it, something that passed across his face in the second before he reached the entity's center, that Gojo, watching through unlimited voids, maintained boundaries, recognized. Not pain, not fear. The specific, familiar weight of someone who had already made peace with feeling nothing, encountering something that was made entirely of feeling, and finding that even this, even the concentrated grief of 10 million people, did not touch the particular emptiness he carried. He hit the entity once. The domain collapsed. The seed network across the Kanto region dissolved simultaneously, every fragment extinguished in the same instant, and the spiritual map of the region went quiet in a way it had not been quiet in years. Gojo released unlimited void. The street was destroyed for 2 blocks in every direction. 3 of the 17 response teams reported injuries. The 15th site's 2 senior sorcerers were hospitalized. The city was structurally intact. Saitama was standing in the wreckage looking at his hand, and the expression that had crossed his face during the passage through the despair field was gone, replaced by the standard mild blankness, but Gojo had seen it. And Nanami, arriving on scene 4 minutes later and reading the aftermath, looked at Saitama and then at Gojo and said quietly, "Did it work?" Gojo said yes. Nanami said, "And next time?" Gojo didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. The ecosystem had just produced something that required a simultaneous domain expansion from the strongest sorcerer alive to give Saitama room to reach it. It had done that in 10 days. The question of what it would produce given another 10 was one that nobody on that street was prepared to answer out loud, because the answer required saying something about the limits of what they could protect, and none of them were ready to say that yet. The quiet lasted 4 days. Not peace, the distinction mattered enormously to everyone paying attention, but the specific operational quiet of a system that had expended significant resources, and was in the process of reorganizing before its next output. Gojo tracked the spiritual ecology of the Kanto region continuously during those 4 days, with the vigilance of someone who understood that the silence was not absence but accumulation, and what he tracked was not reassuring. Seed network had been destroyed, but the dissolution of an ecosystem-level entity of that density left spiritual residue of a kind that didn't dissipate, it settled, sank into the foundational layer of the cursed environment, the way heavy sediment sinks to the bottom of a disturbed body of water, and what it did there was not decay but integrate, becoming part of the baseline from which the next generation of cursed energy would arise. The ecosystem had not been set back by its defeat. It had been enriched by it the same way a forest is enriched by the ash of what it burns. Gojo wrote a 12-page analysis of what his 6 eyes were showing him across those 4 days and submitted it to Yaga with a cover note that said, simply, "Read this before you sleep. It won't help, but read it." The analysis concluded that the ecosystem's next response would not be a single entity, no matter how sophisticated. The single entity approach had been tried in every configuration the system could generate and had produced 48 failures. The distributed domain approach had been the most advanced iteration and had still been insufficient. The analysis projected, based on the integration pattern of the settled residue, and the spiritual pressure curves Gojo was reading in the foundational layer, that the ecosystem's next output would be a fundamental restructuring, not a new curse or a new entity or a new domain technique, but a reorganization of the cursed energy environment itself, at the substrate level, that would attempt to alter the conditions under which Saitama existed in this world, rather than attacking him directly. It was the spiritual equivalent of changing the atmosphere, rather than throwing more rocks at something that caught all the rocks. Whether this was possible, whether the accumulated cursed energy of an entire nation's suffering could be directed with enough coherence to alter the fundamental conditions of a specific individual's existence, was something that Gojo's analysis rated as theoretically without precedent but not categorically impossible given the adaptation rate already demonstrated. Yaga read it at 2 a.m. and did not sleep afterward. He called an emergency session for 6 a.m. that included, for the first time, Tenjin, the immortal sorcerer whose continued existence maintained the barrier infrastructure across Japan, whose perspective on the cursed ecology predated any living institution by centuries, had been briefed on the Saitama situation 4 days after the initial arrival, and had responded with a silence that the representative who delivered the briefing had interpreted as contemplation and later, reviewing the conversation, revised to something closer to recognition. Tenjin's perspective, delivered at the 6 a.m. session through the barrier chamber's communication interface, with the particular measured cadence of someone who had watched civilizations adapt and fail and adapt again across a time span that made the current crisis feel simultaneously urgent and very small, was this: the cursed ecology of Japan had in its deepest history, twice before encountered anomalies that fell outside its processing capacity. Both times the ecosystem had not been destroyed by the anomaly. Both times the ecosystem had reorganized around it, had restructured its foundational logic to incorporate the anomaly as a new parameter rather than a threat to be eliminated. What that reorganization had produced both times was a permanent change in the nature of the cursed environment, a new baseline, a different world than the one that had existed before. The system does not give up, Tenjin said. It has never given up. It changes what it is until what it is can accommodate what it cannot defeat. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Then Nanami said, and if it reorganizes around Saitama, if it restructures to accommodate him as a permanent parameter, what does that world look like? Tenjin said, I don't know, that has never happened with something like this. Yaga said, something like what? Tenjin said, something that exists entirely outside the system's logic. The previous anomalies were still cursed energy phenomena at their root. They could be incorporated because they shared the fundamental substrate. This, a pause that had the weight of someone choosing words with extreme care, does not share the substrate. The system incorporating something it cannot share a substrate with would require it to change not just its parameters but its nature. And I do not know what a cursed ecology looks like after it has changed its nature. I don't think anyone does. Saitama was not at the 6 a.m. session. He had been informed through Yuji that important things were being discussed, and he had said he would come if needed, and in the meantime he was going to find a job because he was running out of money and the convenience store rice balls were getting expensive. Yuji had stared at him for a moment and then said with the particular earnestness that was his defining quality, Saitama-san, you might be the most important person in Japan right now. And Saitama had said, I know, but I still need to eat, and Yuji had found to his own surprise that he didn't have a counter-argument for that. Saitama spent the morning applying for part-time positions at 3 different supermarkets, was turned down by 2 because he couldn't provide documentation, and was accepted by a 3rd whose manager was a practical woman who decided that a man who showed up on time, worked quietly, and didn't cause problems was more valuable than paperwork. He started the following Monday. He stocked shelves. He was good at it. The restructuring began on a Wednesday evening, 11 days after the coordinated response operation. It did not begin with a dramatic emergence or a physical manifestation. It began with a change in the quality of the spiritual atmosphere across the entire Kanto region, that Gojo's 6 eyes registered as a shift in the foundational frequency of the cursed energy environment. Subtle, deep, the kind of change that happened at a level below the threshold of ordinary sorcerer sensing, visible only to the most refined perception available. It felt, Gojo would later describe in his report, like watching the rules of a game change while the game was still being played. The cursed energy in the environment began to behave differently, not more intensely, not in greater concentration, but differently with a kind of structural organization it had not previously possessed, as if the distributed intelligence that the ecosystem had been accumulating across 11 days of failed iterations had finally found a framework that could hold it. Tenjin felt it simultaneously, and sent an emergency communication to Yaga that contained 3 words. The barrier is changing. The barrier infrastructure that Tenjin maintained, the invisible spiritual architecture that separated the cursed world from the civilian world across Japan, that made it possible for 10 million people in Tokyo to live their lives without being consumed by the spiritual environment they were inadvertently generating, was shifting, not breaking, not being attacked. Shifting as if the foundational logic that underpinned it was being gently, systematically revised by something that had learned enough about the system's structure to edit it from the inside. Yaga reached Gojo by phone in 40 seconds. Gojo was already moving. He said, I know, before Yaga finished his first sentence. I've been watching it for the last 20 minutes. It's not coming from outside the barrier. It's coming from inside it. It's coming from the substrate. Yaga said, can you stop it? Gojo said nothing for 3 seconds, which was the longest pause Yaga had ever heard from him. Then he said, I don't know what stopping it would mean. It's not an attack. It's a revision. It's rewriting the conditions. Yaga said, the conditions of what? Gojo said, the conditions of everything. The conditions under which cursed energy exists in this world. It's trying to rewrite the rules so that there's no space in them for something that doesn't use cursed energy. It's trying to make the world one where he can't be. At the supermarket on a Wednesday evening, Saitama was stocking the rice aisle. He had his back to the store entrance and a clipboard in his hand, and he was counting inventory with the methodical patience he applied to anything that required patience, which was most things. He did not feel the spiritual atmosphere changing around him. He did not sense the barrier infrastructure shifting or the foundational frequency of the cursed ecology revising itself in his direction. He had never felt any of it. He was entirely invisible to the system, and the system, in its current iteration, was entirely invisible to him, and that mutual invisibility had defined every interaction between them since his arrival. But the stock boy working the aisle next to him, a university student named Kenji who had no cursed energy and no knowledge of the Jujutsu world and nothing to recommend him to this story except that he was present, looked up from his own clipboard and said, Hey, do you feel that? Saitama said, Feel what? Kenji said, I don't know, like the air is different, like something is about to happen. Saitama looked around the rice aisle. He looked at the fluorescent lights and the neat rows of product and the ordinary, unremarkable interior of a supermarket on a Wednesday evening. He said, I don't feel anything. But somewhere in the spiritual architecture beneath them, in the foundational layer of a world that had been trying for 11 days to find a space that didn't include him, Something had just decided to stop trying to destroy him and start trying to unmake the conditions that made him possible. And the difference between those two strategies was the difference between a fight and something much older and much harder to face. Part 10: The Revision and the Cost of Exist. Tenjin's barrier had stood for over 1,000 years. It was not a technique in the conventional sense, not something cast or maintained through active cursed energy expenditure the way a domain expansion was maintained, but something older and more fundamental, a structural fact about the spiritual architecture of Japan that had become so deeply integrated into the cursed ecology that distinguishing between the barrier and the ecology was, at the deepest level of analysis, a philosophical exercise rather than a practical one. The barrier was the ecology, in the same way that the banks of a river are the river, not the water itself, but the shape that makes the water what it is. When Tenjin said the barrier was changing, what he meant in terms that the 6 a.m. sessions participants were still processing 3 days later was that the shape was changing. The river was becoming something else. And the thing that was driving the change was not attacking the barrier from outside its logic. It was operating from within the logic, using the foundational grammar of the cursed energy system to compose a sentence the system had never composed before. A sentence that, when completed, would describe a world in which the space Saitama occupied did not exist. Gojo understood the mechanism by the second day of the revision, which was fast enough to be impressive and not fast enough to be useful. The ecosystem had spent 11 days failing to destroy Saitama through direct engagement, and had in the process of failing accumulated a detailed functional map of why direct engagement failed, what properties Saitama possessed, what interactions were possible, what the boundaries of the null space he occupied actually looked like from the inside of the system's logic. It had used that map to identify the single point of leverage available to something that could not touch him directly. It could not attack him, it could not contain him, it could not erode him, but it could change the world around him in ways that would make his continued existence in that world progressively more costly, not to him, because nothing was costly to him in the way the system understood cost, but to everyone around him. The revision was not targeted at Saitama. It was targeted at the interface between Saitama and the world, at the thin layer of ordinary reality that connected a man with no cursed energy to a civilization built on cursed energy, and it was systematically dismantling that interface from the substrate up. The first visible effects appeared on the third day. Cursed spirits that would normally have been below the threshold of civilian perception, the low-grade entities that the barrier kept suppressed, that averaged people occasionally glimpsed from the corner of their eyes as shapes that didn't quite resolve, began to be visible. Not to everyone and not fully, but to enough people in enough locations across the Kanto region that the emergency services switchboard received 470 calls in a single morning reporting something wrong in terms that the operators couldn't categorize and the responding units couldn't address. Children were the most affected because children's perception sat closest to the threshold, and the ward offices in 3 Shinjuku districts reported school absences spiking to 40% as parents kept children home in response to reports of their kids describing things that weren't there, except that they were there. The barrier suppression that had kept them below civilian perception for 1,000 years was weakening, and what was underneath it was not the dramatic, physically imposing curses that the response teams dealt with, it was the ambient layer, the constant low-level spiritual noise of a world saturated with negative human emotion, and the experience of suddenly perceiving it without any framework for understanding what you were perceiving was, for the people it happened to, simply terrifying. Nanami filed 3 field reports in 2 days, and each one was longer and more carefully worded than the last, which was how Nanami expressed urgency. The third report concluded with a paragraph that Yaga read 4 times. The revision is not a weapon. It is a restructuring of the conditions under which civilian life in this region is possible. If it continues to its projected completion, the barrier suppression layer will be non-functional within 8 to 12 days, and the civilian population of the Kanto region will be living in direct, unmediated contact with the cursed energy environment they generate. The psychological and social consequences of this are not addressable through Jujutsu operational response. This is not a curse problem. This is a civilization problem. Gojo's response to understanding the mechanism was to do what he always did when confronted with a problem: identify the single point of intervention that would produce the maximum effect and move toward it with total commitment. The single point of intervention in this case was the substrate layer itself, the foundational frequency of the cursed ecology where the revision was being written. If he could enter the substrate layer and disrupt the revision at its source, he could potentially arrest the barrier degradation before it reached the civilian threshold. The problem was that entering the substrate layer was not a documented technique. It was not something sorcerers did. The substrate layer was not a space. It was the condition that made space possible within the cursed energy system, and entering it would require Gojo to operate at a level of cursed energy manipulation that even Infinity and the Six Eyes had never been tested against. He told Yaga he was going to try it. Yaga told him that doing so without understanding the consequences was reckless. Gojo said, "Everything useful I've ever done has been reckless." Yaga looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Come back," and Gojo said, "I always do," with the reflexive brightness he used for everything, except that this time Yaga could see the effort it took. What happened when Gojo entered the substrate layer was not something that could be observed from outside, because the substrate layer had no external-facing dimension. What Nanami and Yuji and the others experienced was Gojo standing in the center of the Shinjuku convergence point, Infinity active, Six Eyes running at absolute maximum resolution, and then going very still, not the stillness of someone who had stopped moving, but the stillness of someone whose entire existence had been redirected inward, every faculty deployed in a direction that had no outward expression. He stood there for 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the revision in the barrier substrate paused, not stopped, not reversed, but paused, as if the presence of something with enough resolution to perceive it had introduced a variable it needed to process. Yuji stood 10 meters back and watched Gojo with the specific anxiety of someone who cared about a person, and was watching them do something that looked like it was costing them something real. Nanami stood 5 meters further back and watched with the analytical attention of someone cataloging what was happening for a report he was already composing in his head. On the 11th minute, Gojo came back. He did not fall. He did not show external injury. He simply transitioned from the inward stillness back to the present moment awareness of someone standing on a street, and he blinked, and he looked at Yuji and Nanami, and he said, "I found it, the revision source, the location in the substrate where it's being writ." Nanami said, "Can you disrupt it?" Gojo said, "No." Word landed with the particular weight of a word that Gojo had never used in that context before. It's not energy, it's not a technique, it's information, accumulated information about the nature of the anomaly, encoded into the substrate logic as a revision parameter. I can't fight information with energy. That's not how information works. Yuji said, "Then what do we do?" Gojo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The revision is writing a world that doesn't have room for him. The only thing that counters a revision is a counter-revision. We need to introduce something into the substrate logic that makes the world actively accommodate his existence rather than exclude it." Nanami said, "How?" Gojo said, "I don't know yet, but I know someone who might." He meant Tenjin. He was also thinking of Saitama, though he didn't say so yet, because what he was thinking raised a question he hadn't fully worked out the implications of, which was whether the substrate could be revised not just by the accumulated information of the ecosystem's failures, but by the accumulated information of Saitama's presence. Whether 48 confrontations, 48 erasures, 48 instances of a physical reality that the system could not process, had left a kind of counter-information in the substrate, a record of a thing that existed outside the logic, pressed so many times against the logic's surface that its shape had begun, however faintly, to be impressed upon it. Whether the world was, without knowing it, already beginning to make room, he didn't know. He needed Tenjin to tell him if the substrate could be read that way, and he needed to have that conversation before the barrier degradation reached the civilian threshold, and he needed all of this to happen in 8 days. And somewhere across the city, Saitama was stocking rice at a supermarket, entirely unaware that the world was in the process of deciding whether he could continue to exist in it, which was, Gojo thought as he walked toward Tenjin's sanctuary, possibly the most fundamentally unfair situation he had ever encountered in a life that had contained a significant number of fundamentally unfair situations. Tenjin's sanctuary sat at the convergence of 4 barrier nodes beneath the Tokyo metropolitan area, accessible through a passage that required both the correct binding vow knowledge and the kind of cursed energy signature that Tenjin's own barrier recognized as non-hostile, which meant that in practical terms the only people who had ever visited it were those Tenjin had explicitly permitted, and those whom Tenjin's barrier had evaluated and decided, through its own thousand-year logic, posed no structural threat to the infrastructure it protected. Gojo had visited twice before. Both times Tenjin had received him with the particular patience of someone for whom the passage of time had long since ceased to feel urgent. And both times the conversations had been among the most genuinely useful Gojo had ever had, which was a high bar given that Gojo's threshold for useful was calibrated against his own considerable intellect. He arrived this time with Yaga, because the decision that needed to be made after Tenjin's answer was one that required institutional authority as well as tactical understanding, and with Nanami, because Nanami's precision was the most reliable counter to Gojo's tendency to move faster than the implications of his own thinking. Tenjin was already aware of why they had come. The barrier's sensitivity to the substrate revision meant that Tenjin had been experiencing the change as a continuous low-level intrusion for days, not painful, because pain required a certain relationship to embodied existence that Tenjin had largely transcended but perceptible, the way a musician perceives a note that is slightly but persistently off-key. When Gojo laid out the count-revision theory, The possibility that Saitama's repeated interactions with the system had impressed a counter-information pattern into the substrate that could be amplified into an active accommodation parameter. Tenjin listened with the eyes of someone who was simultaneously present in the conversation and consulting a much larger body of experience that the conversation was only touching the surface of. When Gojo finished, Tenjin was quiet for a long time. Then Tenjin said, "You are correct that the impressions exist. Every contact between the anomaly and the system's logic has left a trace in the substrate, and the accumulated traces do form a coherent pattern. Your instinct about what the pattern represents is also correct. The substrate has begun involuntarily to develop a grammar for his existence." A pause, "But you are wrong about what amplifying it would require." Gojo said, "Tell me." Tenjin said, "The counter-revision cannot be initiated from outside the substrate. It must be initiated from within it by something that already has a presence in it. The ecosystem's revision is being written from within because the ecosystem is substrate. It is foundational to this world in a way that allows it to edit the foundational layer. To counter it, you need something equally foundational. Something that has been pressed against the substrate long enough and with enough force that it has become, in a structural sense, part of it." Nanami said, "The impressions Saitama left." Tenjin said, "Yes, but impressions are passive. To initiate a counter-revision, they need to become active. They need to be activated from within by the source that made them." Yaga said carefully, "You're saying Saitama needs to enter the substrate?" Tenjin said, "Yes." Yaga said, "He has no cursed energy." "The substrate is a cursed energy construct. How does someone with no cursed energy enter a cursed energy substrate?" Tenjin said, "He doesn't enter it the way a sorcerer would. He enters it the way he does everything else, by being what he is in proximity to it at sufficient depth with sufficient force. The barrier passage to the substrate layer is not a technique, it is a threshold, and thresholds in my experience are not barriers to something that does not acknowledge barriers." The silence that followed this was the silence of three people processing a statement that was both completely clear and deeply difficult to act on. What Tenjin was describing was not a plan with operational parameters. It was not something that could be rehearsed or risk-assessed or written into a deployment document with contingency protocols. It was, in the most literal sense, asking Saitama to punch his way into the foundational layer of a world that was trying to erase him, in the hope that the act of doing so would activate the traces his existence had left there, and produce a counter-revision that would stop the barrier degradation before 10 million civilians lost the spiritual protection they had lived inside for 1,000 years without ever knowing it existed. Gojo looked at the ceiling of Tenjin's sanctuary for a moment, then looked back at Tenjin and said, "And if it works, if the counter-revision activates and the substrate accommodates him, what does accommodation look like? What does the world become?" Tenjin said, "A world that has made room for something outside its logic. A world with a larger logic." Gojo said, "And the cursed ecology," Tenjin said, "changed permanently. A substrate that is incorporated an accommodation parameter for a non-cursed existence will generate curses differently than it has before. The nature of the curses, their behavior, their relationship to human suffering, all of it will shift. I cannot tell you precisely how. I can tell you that it will not be the same world." Nanami said, "Better or worse?" Tenjin said, "Different. Whether different is better or worse depends on what you value about the world you have now." They told Saitama that evening. Yuji came with them because they had agreed, without explicitly discussing it, that Yuji's presence made conversations with Saitama go better. Not because Saitama was difficult, but because Yuji had developed the ability to translate between the Jujutsu world's framework and the register in which Saitama naturally communicated, which was the register of someone who dealt with things directly and without elaborate framing. They found him in his apartment. He had moved to a slightly better one now that he had income from the supermarket, sitting on a new futon he had bought, eating dinner, watching a television program about home renovation with the mild, uncommitted attention he gave to things that were not monsters. Gojo sat down without being invited, which was consistent with his general approach to personal space, and laid out everything: the substrate revision, the barrier degradation, the counter-revision theory, Tenjin's assessment, the threshold mechanism, what success would mean, and what the world would look like afterward. He laid it out in full without simplification, because he had decided after their first meeting that Saitama deserved to be spoken to as someone capable of handling the full weight of a situation, which he clearly was. He finished and waited. Saitama ate a piece of his dinner. He set his chopsticks down. He looked at Gojo with the expression he used when something had his genuine attention, which was almost identical to his expression when he didn't have genuine attention except slightly more present in the eyes. He said, "So the world is trying to make it so I never existed here." Gojo said, "Essentially, yes." Saitama said, "And if I go into this substrate thing and punch it, the world might accommodate me instead, but it changes permanently and you don't know exactly how." Gojo said, "Yes." Saitama said, "And if I don't do it, 10 million people lose their protection and start seeing things that terrify them and it gets worse from there." Gojo said, "Yes." Saitama said, "And there's a chance it doesn't work." Gojo paused, then said, "Yes." Saitama nodded slowly, the nod of someone who had made a decision approximately 40 seconds ago and was now confirming it to himself. He said, "Okay." He picked his chopsticks back up and ate another piece of his dinner. Yuji looked at him and said, "That's it, just okay." Saitama said, "What else would I say?" He gestured at the television at the apartment, at the window through which the lights of Tokyo were visible in the ordinary indifferent way that city lights are always visible at night. "People are going to get hurt if I don't, that's the whole job." The operation was set for the following morning. Tenjin identified the optimal approach point, a location in the Shinjuku ward where the substrate layer sat closest to physical surface reality, where the accumulated impression traces from Saitama's 48 encounters were most densely concentrated, where the threshold between the world and the foundational logic beneath it was thinnest. Jujutsu response teams were deployed around the perimeter not to assist. There was nothing they could do to assist, but to manage whatever physical manifestation the substrate activation produced at the surface level, which Tenjin projected would be significant. Gojo would monitor from the substrate's edge with his 6 eyes, tracking the counter-revision's propagation and standing ready to reinforce the barrier nodes if the revision process destabilized them before the accommodation parameter could stabilize. Nanami would coordinate the surface teams. Yaga would be at Tenjin's sanctuary in direct communication with both. Everyone had a role. Saitama's role was to walk to a specific intersection in Shinjuku at 6 a.m., stand at the center of it, and punch down. That was the entirety of his operational briefing. He said it sounded like most of his work. What nobody said that night, in any of the conversations that happened after the briefing, not Gojo, not Nanami, not Yaga, not Yuji, who stayed with Saitama until midnight just talking, which Saitama seemed to appreciate in the way he appreciated most things, quietly and without making it a thing, was what the irreversible change to the substrate would mean for the curses that would be generated afterward, in a world that had expanded its logic to include something unprecedented. The changed world would still have curses. It would still have suffering. It would still require people who were willing to stand between the ordinary world and the things that the ordinary world generated in its pain and fear and accumulated grief. It would just also have something that had never been part of the equation before, a permanent accommodation for a thing that didn't fit, pressed into the foundational logic of reality by the simple, relentless fact of its existence. And whether that made the world larger or stranger or more dangerous or something that didn't have a word yet, would not be known until after the threshold was crossed. It would not be known, in fact, until the morning, when a bald man in a yellow jumpsuit walked to an intersection in Shinjuku at 6 a.m. and punched the ground with everything he had for the first time in this world for real. The intersection was empty at 6 a.m. in the way that major city intersections are only ever empty when something has deliberately made them so. The evacuation perimeter held by surface teams 3 blocks out in every direction. The streets cleared, the overhead signals still cycling through their colors for nobody, green to yellow to red in the particular mechanical indifference of infrastructure that doesn't know it's been asked to witness something. The morning was overcast, the light flat and gray and even, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more real than usual, stripped of shadow and contrast, every surface simply itself. Saitama stood at the center of the intersection and looked down at the asphalt beneath his feet. He had worn his hero costume, which he did not always do. He had explained to Yuji once, in the matter-of-fact way he explained everything, that he wore it when something felt like it was going to be a real fight, not because it provided any protection but because it felt right, the same way a uniform felt right, the way dressing for something acknowledged that the something mattered. The cape was very white in the gray morning light. He looked to the surface teams watching from 3 blocks away, exactly like what he was, a man standing alone in an empty intersection, preparing to do something that nobody had a category for. Gojo was at the substrate threshold. Perception extended to its absolute limit. 6 eyes running at a resolution he had never previously needed to sustain for more than seconds at a time now held as a continuous state. Watching the foundational layer of the world with the total focused attention of someone who understood that what happened in the next few minutes would be visible in his sensory record for the rest of his life, regardless of what else he saw. The substrate revision was still active, still writing, still systematically dismantling the accommodation space that Saitama's presence had accidentally created by simply existing in the world for 19 days. The barrier degradation had reached 63% of the civilian threshold. Tenjin had communicated this at 5:50 a.m. with the particular tone of someone delivering information they wished they didn't have. 3 more days at the current rate, possibly 2. The people of Tokyo had no idea. They were waking up, making coffee, getting children ready for school, doing the 10,000 ordinary things that ordinary mornings required, inside the protection of a barrier that was quietly, systematically being unwritten beneath them. Saitama crouched down. He placed one hand flat on the asphalt, the same way you might press your palm to the ground to feel if it's warm, and he stayed there for a moment in that position. And what was happening in that moment, what neither Gojo nor anyone else with sensory capability could fully read, because it was happening in the null space that Saitama permanently occupied, was something that had no technical description. It was a man in a yellow jumpsuit pressing his hand to the ground of a world that was trying to erase him, and feeling nothing spiritual in return because he never felt anything spiritual, and deciding that this was fine. that the inability to feel the thing did not change the responsibility to address it. He had spent 3 years feeling nothing in his own world, 3 years of fighting things that couldn't challenge him, of winning completely and feeling the wind land with the weight of a leaf falling, of standing in the aftermath of every victory with the quiet, persistent ache of someone who had optimized himself past the point where the world could give him back what he'd spent to reach it. He knew what it was to act without feeling the stakes. He had done it hundreds of times. He did it now. He stood up. He drew his right arm back with the economy of someone who had made this motion so many times it had passed through the phase of being a technique, and emerged on the other side as simply what his body did when it needed to. There was no wind-up. There was no dramatic pause. There was no moment where the air compressed or the light changed or any of the physical cues that preceded the kind of force he was about to release, because the force didn't come from physics building toward a release point. It came from him entirely all at once, and it went down. The punch hit the asphalt and went through it, through the street and the infrastructure beneath it and the geological layers beneath that, and all the physical depth that lay between the surface of the world and the substrate layer where the foundational logic of the cursed ecology was written. And it hit the substrate the way it hit everything, with the simple, absolute, conceptual finality of a force that did not negotiate with the things it contacted. The physical shockwave at surface level destroyed the intersection in a radius of 40 meters and sent a pressure wave outward through the street grid that the surface teams felt as a physical impact through their feet and their chests from 3 blocks away. The overhead signals shattered. The road surface for 40 meters in every direction simply ceased to be road surface. Saitama stood at the center of it, arm extended downward into a hole that went further than holes were supposed to go, and the physical event was significant and total and also entirely beside the point, because what mattered was not happening at the surface. Gojo felt it at the substrate level as the most coherent, concentrated, purely physical input the foundational layer had ever received. Not cursed energy, not technique, not information encoded in the grammar of the spiritual system, but raw, absolute physical reality pressed against the substrate with enough force to do what 19 days of existence had done gradually and passively in a single instant actively. The impression traces that Saitama had left across 48 encounters, the accumulated negative space of a thing that existed outside the system's logic, pressed again and again against its surface, until the surface had begun to remember the shape, activated simultaneously, all of them, the passive record becoming an active parameter in the single moment that the source of those impressions made direct, deliberate, maximal contact with the layer that held them. The counter-vision ignited the way a distributed network ignites when its central node receives full power, all at once, every node simultaneously, the pattern that had been building for 19 days completing itself in a fraction of a second. Gojo watched it happen with his 6 eyes and could not entirely process what he was seeing, which had not happened to him since childhood. The substrate revision, the ecosystem's painstaking rewriting of the conditions of Saitama's existence, did not stop. It was not interrupted or disrupted or pushed back. It was answered the way one sentence answers another, with a counterstatement written in the same foundational grammar but carrying the opposite conclusion. The revision had been writing, there is no space here for a thing that does not belong to this system's logic. The counter-revision wrote, the system's logic is now large enough to include a thing that does not belong to it. Both statements were true simultaneously, because the substrate could hold that contradiction in the way that only foundational logic can hold contradictions, not by resolving them but by expanding until both fit. The barrier degradation stopped at 63%, and then over the course of approximately 90 seconds that Gojo tracked with absolute attention, reversed, not to its previous state, because the substrate was not what it had been before, but to a new equilibrium, a different stability, the barrier reconstituting itself around a logic that had permanently changed. Tenjin felt the reconstitution and communicated to Yaga in 2 words. It held. Yaga relayed to Nanami. Nanami looked at the destroyed intersection from his position 3 blocks away, at Saitama standing in the center of it with his arm at his side and his cape settling in the stillness after the shockwave, and followed the information in the part of his mind he reserved for things that would require extensive documentation later. The surface teams held their perimeter. The city around them continued to wake up, continued to make coffee and get children ready for school, continued to exist inside a barrier that was now protecting them with a logic that had not existed the day before. The changed substrate expressed itself in the cursed ecology over the following days in ways that the senior research division would spend months attempting to fully document. The curses that generated in the Kanto region after the counter-revision were different, not weaker, not stronger, but structured differently, as if the grammar of their existence had acquired a new clause. They were more complex, more varied, less predictable in their behavior, as if the foundational logic that generated them had been asked to accommodate a larger set of parameters and had responded by producing outputs with more degrees of freedom. Some sorcerers found them harder to read. Some found them more legible. Gojo found them on balance more interesting, which he considered a net positive, and which Nanami considered an extremely Gojo way of assessing a permanent change to the nature of the threat landscape. The barrier held at its new equilibrium. The civilian population of Tokyo never knew how close the threshold had come. They went about their lives in the ordinary way, inside the protection of something that had rewritten itself to survive, which is perhaps the most human thing that has ever been done by something that was not human. Saitama went back to work on Monday. The supermarket manager had seen the news coverage of the Shinjuku intersection and had very carefully not asked about it, because she had decided that a man who showed up on time, worked quietly, and didn't cause problems was still more valuable than an explanation. He stocked shelves. He was still good at it. Yuji visited him on his lunch break and sat with him on the loading dock, and they ate convenience store onigiri in the companionable silence of two people who had been through something together that neither of them fully had the language for yet. After a while, Yuji said, "Is this it? Is it over?" Saitama looked out at the ordinary city street visible from the loading dock, the people walking, the traffic moving, the unremarkable, irreplaceable texture of ordinary life continuing, and he said, "Probably not. It's never really over." Yuji said, "Does that bother you?" Saitama thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about anything. He said, "Not really. If it was over, I'd have nothing to do." He finished his onigiri. He looked at the street. Somewhere beneath it, in the foundational layer of a world that had been forced to grow larger than it had been, the logic of the cursed ecology continued to operate according to rules that now permanently included room for something it had never been designed to accommodate. A bald man in a yellow jumpsuit who had shown up in a crater asked for directions to a grocery store, and by the simple, relentless fact of his existence, changed the nature of the world. He did not know he had done it. He suspected it, the way you suspect the shape of something you can't see directly. He didn't need to know. The job was to show up, and he had shown up, and the world had changed not because he had intended to change it, but because the world had run out of options for making him leave. The strongest thing sometimes is not the thing that breaks everything in its path. It's the thing that simply refuses, quietly and completely, to be erased. Saitama finished his lunch, stood up, and went back inside to finish stocking the rice aisle. The work was not done. It was never done, but it was today enough.